In a small town, everyone knew about Dan. He lived in an old, worn-down house with his mother, who struggled to make ends meet after her husband had passed away. Dan wore second-hand clothes, sometimes came to school without breakfast, and was always the one people laughed at. But no one tormented him more than his neighbor, Rick. The son of wealthy parents, Rick had everything he wanted. A brand new bike, the latest phone, and a group of friends who echoed his every word. Every morning when Dan stepped out for school, Rick would shout over the fence, "Hey, poor boy. Wanna earn some cash and wash my bike?" Dan clenched his fists but stayed silent. Deep inside, he made himself a promise. One day he would prove that money doesn't always decide everything. One day he would make Rick regret every single word. At school, the humiliation continued. Dan was quiet, reserved, and focused on his studies, but Rick made sure to turn every classroom into a stage for mockery. If Dan wore the same shirt twice in a week, Rick pointed it out loudly. If Dan didn't have money for lunch, Rick would buy extra food just to throw it away in front of him. The laughter of classmates echoed in Dan's ears like daggers. One day during lunch, Rick leaned across the table with his usual smug grin. "You know, Dan, you should thank me. Without me, nobody would even notice you exist. I'm basically making you famous." His friends burst out laughing. Dan stared at the table, his hands trembling. He wanted to scream, to fight back, but he knew it would only make things worse. Instead, he swallowed his pride and said nothing. That night, when he got home, he found his mother crying over unpaid bills. Something inside Dan broke. He wasn't just angry at Rick anymore, he was angry at the whole world. But instead of despair, a fire lit up inside him. He swore that no matter how long it took, he would rise above all of them. The years went by, and Rick's arrogance only grew. His parents bought him a car for his 16th birthday, and he paraded it around town like a trophy. Dan, meanwhile, worked part-time jobs after school, cleaning tables at diners, mowing lawns, anything to help his mother keep the lights on. People often wondered why Dan didn't just give up. But what they didn't see was the notebook he carried everywhere. In it, he wrote ideas, plans, and dreams. Every insult from Rick fueled those pages. Every humiliation became another reason to keep going. One afternoon, after Rick had yet again humiliated him in front of a crowd by pretending to donate him some coins, Dan looked him in the eye for the first time. "Enjoy it while it lasts, Rick," he said quietly. Rick raised an eyebrow, then laughed. "And what are you gonna do? Write me an essay?" But Rick didn't realize that behind Dan's silence was determination. And behind his cheap clothes and tired eyes was a mind sharper than anyone gave him credit for. That same year, Dan discovered something that would change his life forever. Computers. The school's old library had a few outdated machines, and while other students wasted time online, Dan devoured every article, tutorial, and free course he could find. He taught himself coding late into the night, his fingers flying across the keyboard while his mother slept in the next room. The more he learned, the more confident he became. For the first time in his life, Dan had something Rick couldn't take away from him: knowledge. One day Rick caught him in the library. "Look at this loser," Rick sneered. "Studying instead of living. You really think staring at that old screen is gonna make you rich?" Dan didn't answer. He just smiled faintly and kept typing. Inside, though, he whispered to himself, "Just wait." By the time senior year arrived, Rick was the king of the school. He was prom king candidate, the star of every party, and the guy everyone wanted to be friends with. Dan was still the quiet one in the corner. But what no one saw was the empire he was quietly building in his notebook and on that dusty school computer. Rick may have ruled the school, but Dan was preparing to rule the future. And deep down, Rick had no idea that the poor boy he mocked every day would one day own everything he had ever dreamed of. After high school, Rick's path seemed clear. His parents had already paid for his college tuition, a brand new car, and even set him up with connections for a future job. He strutted around town with the same arrogance, convinced the world was his playground. Dan's path was different. He couldn't afford college right away. Instead, he worked at a local diner, washing dishes and serving tables. Every tip went into a small jar he hid under his bed. At night, after long shifts, he returned to his computer. While others slept, Dan built websites, experimented with apps, and studied business. His eyes burned from exhaustion, but he didn't care. Every line of code was another step toward his promise. The promise to make Rick regret every word. At first, success didn't come. His apps failed. His websites barely attracted visitors. He faced rejection after rejection. But each failure only sharpened his resolve. Then one day everything changed. Dan had been working on a simple online platform, a marketplace for local artists to sell their work. It wasn't fancy, but it solved a real problem. Word spread quickly. Within months, small artists from across the state were signing up. The site exploded in popularity. Advertisers called. Investors reached out. For the first time, Dan saw his bank account grow. Not just a few dollars, but thousands. Then tens of thousands. He couldn't believe it. The boy who once couldn't afford lunch was now making more money in a month than Rick's parents paid for his car. One Saturday afternoon, as Dan walked down the street in a crisp new shirt, he heard the familiar voice. Well, look who's trying to play dress up. It was Rick, leaning against his shiny car, surrounded by his friends. He looked Dan up and down and smirked. Did you borrow that shirt, poor boy? Or did your mom finally win the lottery? Dan paused, then smiled faintly. No lottery, Rick. Just hard work. Rick scoffed. Right. Like someone like you could ever make it. Don't kid yourself. But as Rick drove off with his friends, Dan couldn't help but notice the cracks. Rick's arrogance was the same, but beneath it there was something else, insecurity. The years passed. Dan's platform expanded nationwide, then globally. He hired employees, opened offices, and invested in new ventures. He wasn't just surviving anymore, he was thriving. Meanwhile, Rick's story wasn't as glamorous. College hadn't turned out the way he planned. He partied more than he studied, and when graduation came, he barely scraped by. His parents' money got him a job, but not respect. And slowly the roles began to shift. One evening, Dan attended a business gala in the city. He walked through the grand hall, shaking hands with investors, CEOs, and politicians. Then he froze. Across the room, carrying a tray of champagne glasses, was Rick. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rick's face turned pale, then red. He quickly looked away, pretending not to see. Dan's heart raced. The same boy who had once mocked him every day was now working as a waiter at an event where Dan was the guest of honor. He could have humiliated him then and there. He could have shouted, laughed, and repaid every insult. But instead, Dan simply smiled and walked past. Because true revenge, he realized, wasn't about shouting. It was about winning so completely that the other person couldn't even look you in the eye. Still, fate wasn't done. A few months later, Rick appeared again, this time at Dan's office. He wore a cheap suit, clutching a resume in his trembling hands. Dan, he said quietly, avoiding eye contact. I heard your company is hiring. I was wondering if maybe... Dan studied him for a long moment. The once arrogant neighbor now stood before him, desperate and broken. You know, Rick, Dan said slowly, I used to dream about this moment. I wanted to see you beg. To see you suffer the way I did. Rick swallowed hard. Please. I just need a chance. Dan leaned back in his chair. He could have slammed the door in his face. He could have laughed and thrown him out. But instead he smiled. I'll think about it, he said. Rick left the office that day, humiliated, unsure if Dan would call. That night, Dan sat alone in his penthouse apartment, staring out at the city lights. He had everything he once dreamed of: money, success, power. But the question gnawed at him: was this enough? He remembered his promise. He remembered every insult, every cruel laugh, every coin thrown at his feet. He had won, but something inside still craved closure. And that closure was coming. Because Dan had one last plan. And this time, it wouldn't just be about proving Rick wrong, it would be about showing the whole town how the tables had turned. Months passed and Dan's empire only grew. His company became a household name, his face appeared in magazines, and his success was the talk of the town. Everyone who once ignored him now wanted to be part of his world. Everyone, including Rick. Dan hadn't hired him. Not because he couldn't, but because he wanted something bigger. A lesson that Rick would never forget. One crisp autumn morning, Dan returned to his hometown for the first time in years. As his sleek black car rolled down the familiar street, people peeked through their curtains, whispering his name. The poor boy had come back, but now he was a millionaire. Rick was still there, living in his parents' old house. But things had changed. His parents had lost much of their wealth through bad investments, and Rick himself had bounced from one failed job to another. The once golden boy of the neighborhood now lived in quiet shame. When Dan stepped out of his car, the entire block seemed to freeze. Kids stopped playing. Neighbors stared. And Rick, standing in his front yard, looked like he'd seen a ghost. Dan? He muttered, his voice trembling. Dan smiled calmly. Hello, Rick. Long time no see. Rick forced a laugh. Wow, you've done well for yourself. I knew you had potential. Did you? Dan asked softly. His eyes locked onto Rick's, and for the first time in his life, Rick looked away. That evening, Dan invited the entire neighborhood to a gathering. He rented out the community center, brought in catering, music, lights. A celebration the small town had never seen before. Everyone came. Everyone except Rick. Halfway through the night, Dan stood on stage, microphone in hand. He spoke about his journey, his struggles, his mother's sacrifices. The crowd listened in awe. Then he paused. "There was a time," Dan said slowly, "when I was nothing. When people laughed at me, humiliated me, and told me I would never succeed. But I made myself a promise, that one day I'd return. And here I am." The room erupted in applause. Dan scanned the faces and finally at the back of the room he saw him, Rick, standing alone, pale and sweating. Dan smiled. "And I think it's time for one more announcement. As of today, I've purchased several properties in this town. Including," he paused dramatically, "the house across the street from where I grew up." The crowd gasped. Everyone knew exactly whose house that was. Rick's knees nearly buckled. His family home, the place where he once mocked Dan every morning, was now owned by the very boy he had ridiculed. The next week Rick showed up at Dan's new office downtown. His voice was hoarse, his eyes bloodshot. "Dan, please, don't take the house. It's all I have left." Dan leaned back in his chair, studying him. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he spoke quietly, almost kindly. "Do you remember, Rick? When you used to shout at me over the fence? When you threw coins at my feet? When you told me I'd never be anything?" Rick's lips trembled. "I was just a kid." Dan leaned forward. "So was I. But words matter. And actions matter. And now here we are." Rick's eyes filled with tears. "Please. I'll do anything." Dan considered him carefully. He could have crushed him right there, taken everything without mercy. But instead he saw something else: fear. Humility. A man who finally understood the pain he once caused. So Dan gave him an answer. "You can stay," he said. "But you'll pay rent. To me. Every month." Rick's face went pale. It was humiliation in its purest form, living in the same house but knowing he no longer owned it. Knowing that every month he would hand over money to the boy he once mocked. As the years rolled on, Rick faded into the background. A shadow of the arrogant neighbor he once was. Every time he wrote a rent check, he remembered the laughter, the insults, the coins he had thrown away. And Dan? He moved forward. His company grew, his influence spread, but he never forgot where he came from. He never forgot the promise he had made to himself as a boy. One night, standing on the balcony of his penthouse, Dan whispered to himself, "Revenge isn't about shouting. It isn't about fighting. It's about winning so completely that they can't even look at you without remembering." He smiled, watching the city lights shimmer below. Rick had taken his childhood. But Dan had taken his future. And that was the sweetest revenge of all.